To do a ruffle collar, it can be done in the same manner that we did our simple collar, but I want to do something different. I'm going to use my You Can Make It ruffle pattern cut from my two 9-inch by 10-inch scraps, mark the wrong side, and pretend I want to trim the edge of my collar. Now I told you to only get a 3-inch piece of trim only because I didn't want you to purchase trim for this collar sample. It's a pretty large collar. If you like this look, you can still purchase more trim and apply to the complete collar at a later date. Now, your simple collar had two pieces, an upper and an under collar. When we sewed them together, we finished off this outside edge. With your ruffle collar, you don't always need or want two pieces of fabric. Sometimes 2 layers of fabric will take away from the drape of a ruffle collar. Now this collar is in 2 halves, the left side and the right side. And we must sew them up the center to give us one complete collar. In my sample, it's going to be the center back. But since we are not going to have an under collar, there will be nothing to hide the possible fraying of this seam. So we are going to construct our collar using a French seam. We will discuss later other applications for French seams. French seams are easy. We have our collar marked as far as the right and wrong side. Now take the 2 collar halves and place them wrong sides together. Pin the center back seam and stitch the long straight edge at a 3/8 of an inch seam. Okay, we sewed the center back seam at 3/8 of an inch. Be advised that all seams are sewn at 5/8 of an inch. I wanted you to sew 3/8, and then I'm going to make you turn it and sew 2/8 from this edge, encasing these raw edges. Understand that this original 3/8 plus this 2/8 that I'm going to sew gives you your 5/8 inch seam allowance from your original cut edge. Before we sew that 2/8, let's go and trim the seam allowance in half and press it to one side. Now turn your collar with right sides together and press flat at this seam line. Pin it and then stitch 2/8 of an inch from this fold. That first 3/8 of an inch seam plus this 2/8 of an inch seam will give you your required 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on the center back seam of the collar. Press this seam to one side. Notice how we just encased the cut edges in this seam allowance. When this collar blows in the wind, it will look pretty underneath. No raw edges of a seam allowance showing. So far, so good. Now let's finish off the outside edge of this collar. To do this, we will be folding this edge under 2 times and stitching, trying to fold as little as possible and keeping the amount of each fold constant. Make sure the raw edges are underneath well and our outer edge looks smooth. When folding under 2 times on a curve such as this collar, it can get difficult. Think of this as a triangle. We are trying to fold the large end into the short end. The trick is to keep dividing into work sections, stretching and fitting as you go around. For example, start pinning at any one point. Then instead of pinning right next to that starting point, skip about 2 inches or so and pin again. Then go back in the middle and pin. Then go in between those 2 points, folding under, stretching, and pinning it in place, keeping your outside edge smooth. Continue pinning in this manner for the complete circle. The trick here is that if you just start at the beginning and go to the end, you will not be constantly dispersing this curve. Remember, constantly cutting in half and stretch. This is the secret to pinning a curved area. Curves are very hard to keep smooth. I am stretching my work as I work, but since I've been doing it for so many years, it may not look like it. So I'm going to exaggerate. Hold this down and stretch and pin in place. I'm holding down with this hand, looking at this bottom edge so that it's smooth. Again, placing pins parallel to the edge so we don't run out of pins. Pin the complete circle in this manner, taking your time to get it even and smooth. If you have some bumpy parts, it's okay. You will get better with practice. Just remember, skip and stretch. When you're done, be proud. This is not easy. Now stitch this fold in place, making sure that your stitching is far enough in to catch that first fold so your raw edges don't show. Sew this very slowly. And remember from level 2, we want to watch this edge. This stitching will show on the right side, and that is what we want to look nice. We aren't very concerned that our fold is exact. Besides, when the wind blows, people will be so impressed with our French seam that they will never notice if we are or are not perfectly even with our fold. Now that was the hard part. Here's the easy part. I have lace or trim I want to put on the edge of the collar. The difference being from before that both edges of my trim are finished off nicely and I want both edges to show, which means I don't want to hide it in any of my seams. Just pin in place, again checking for the right and wrong side of your trim. The right side up, pin it in place from the edge according to your own personal taste. This time you may not want to fold over your trim. Just let the end go into the seam allowance. With the lace, we didn't want it caught in the seam allowance because it was meant to hang free. Pin the complete trim in place. Sew with a thread that matches the trim. If this is a different color than your garment, make sure to use the contrast thread on the top and your garment's color thread in the bobbin. This way, the thread will be matching on both sides. In my example, I will use white thread on the top and a peach thread on the bobbin. Be advised, however, that if the two threads are at the opposite ends of the color chart, that bottom thread will create a tiny loop that will show on the top. So test the look to see if you want to use the same color in the top and the bobbin of your machine. What really matters is the appearance on the top of the garment. Pin the complete trim in place and then sew with your machine. What a nice ruffle collar and simple collar. I hope you realize by now that both these collars are interchangeable. You can put lace on your ruffle, trim on your simple, or neither. You can also add an undercollar on your ruffle collar to insert lace easily. But don't omit an undercollar on a simple collar. You need an undercollar on a simple collar to give it its shape. Pin both your sample collars to your sewing bag, and if you've created either one for real, we will now attach it.